Hello everyone, today we talk about high medieval Europe and more specifically what we call Post-Carolingian Europe, but in fact not stressing much this phase as a, let's say, a part or an appendix of what had happened, or at least, something that had occurred in function of the Carolingian Empire, but essentially as an era on its own that I dedicated in fact, what I called still Post-Carolingian Europe playlist to, that you can partly appreciate even in the Renovatio Imperii one. I still haven't created a 10th century playlist, but I will soon. But it's also beyond that, right? It partly starts even before the St. Carolingian Europe as far as the defining dynamics are concerned, and also there ends pretty late in time. You can't even properly define it, as you can't define the Middle Ages in spite of some macroscopic dynamics. It's always very complicated to didactically categorize, and simply providing with a an accurate picture of what defines an era just per se. But by approximation, what we mostly call as in fact post-Carolingian Europe, also the period of second invasions, the Iron Century. These mostly have to do with the I would say, second half of the 10th century Europe, so essentially before the Ottonian Renovatio Imperii. But this other phase could be extended easily up to the mid-11th century, so a century later. And you understand that it's a pretty long time, right? They're fundamentally couple of hundred years from the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire that opened to a new, especially political institutional phase in Europe that we tend to overlook for a number of reasons. First of all, because of course we are mostly concerned with political compaction per se, statal realities, whatever was able to hold things together. And this is very important, of course, but there is not a literal direct proportionality between like a level of power concentration, let's say, or a unitary direction in the effort and the actual achievements, right, all the time. Really, there are phases in which this is true. There are others in which this doesn't quite work in the same way, and or at least we try to attribute a rather negative character as opposed to see what eventually was this phase was able to engineer, right? It's the crisis moment, fundamentally. It's the one, in fact, that, as I was saying before, has received also mostly the military nickname as the Iron Century, and mostly also with a negative bias attached to it. That is to say, this was the phase of the second invasions. It was bad, dark, things were contracting once again, and especially this latter aspect is not correct, historically speaking. We're going against historiographical assumptions, sometimes together with other historiographical assumptions, but the revival of the year 1000, the story that, the better plow was introduced, and so agriculture, which of course never happened because, most of the technological advancement occurred in areas that were actually backwards compared to others. And that remained so, by the way. The crop rates do not increase significantly throughout this age. There are lots of things that we can point at when looking at the causes per se, but I think most of what actually can answer profitably to those questions is just, first of all, coming after the assessment of the broader era as such, right? What is that, for example, the 10th, 11th century really stand out for, and or why compared to the other eras, and what was happening there that, say, wasn't happening before or afterwards, and we can't more or less categorize as a period on its own. The revival started occurring at this point, right? It had started occurring since the end of the 8th century, what we call the Dark Ages, improperly lasted at worst 150 years, right? And you can also discuss relatively to the to the degree, of course, of darkness, and especially looking at different parts of Europe compared, let's say. But there's this idea that, again, whatever happened before the year 1000 was a sort of dark dimension that in part, like as far as the Dark Ages are concerned, may be true. As far as the sources availability are concerned, right? Of course, we have less by the 10th century, and part of the reason why we came up with the idea of the revival of the year 1000 is that at that point we start having enough sources to describe things better, but this is just the accomplishment of what was happening before, and the more, of course, we discover about the 10th century, the more we realize that there was an incredibly powerful growth that had started, right, intensively and extensively out of this period. The phase is interesting because, as we'll see now, this expansion starts from the bottom up. It's not managed, if not at importantly local level rather than a hierarchical one. There are still emperors, there are still kings, there is still naturally a broader unity, right, in what the former Carolingian Empire really was. There is this improperness also in considering the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't even called like that at the time of Otto the First, as essentially a new empire compared to the Carolingian one. And there are, of course, some specific features and characteristics that the Ottonians bring in, such as properly the full Romanization of the empire as such, the also some properly political territorial connections between Germany and Italy, and so what we call as the Holy Roman Empire until the 19th century, mostly, owing much to, but approximations are always risky, and today we will not descend in the political ideology that, as you have understood, mostly following my videos, is the one of a especially imperial universal continuity. But things did change, of course, as much as the Carolingian dynasty had provided this system essentially with a unitary direction, and because of the same nature of this expansion that kept things under a single rule, right, there wasn't kind of a backup plan for when this thing would have outstretched, right? And so the Franks began to clash against one another, and so what you see even dramatically, the Vikings and the Magyars and the Saracens, that invaded and destroyed, actually was just a consequence of something that was going on within, as a primary mover, right, within the empire, right? Not just because, of course, the Carolingians threw the Vikings at each other, the same, later on was done by their successors with the Magyars and things like, or even the Saracens and things like that. But because, of course, we tend to see Europe as vulnerable, of course, in those times, there is also kind of a tribalistic, ethnicistic revaluation in pop culture of the second invasions. Like, we were these peoples that didn't want to conform to this terrible Christian empire in the European continent, and that actually, tell you pretty, also, if you know how the thing ended, and especially what happened after the end of the second invasions to those same peoples, but to Europe as a whole. I don't think there can be many doubts about what the hardcore reality actually was, right? And of course, Europe boomed and started booming in part also because of the effort that was required to cope with these invasions, with the necessity not much of stemming a military force per se, but in putting together back again on its feet the original political, say, royal, or sometimes even in fact imperial dimension and restarting again. And of course, the world in between had never kind of stopped per se, because again, nobody had ever said, okay, we don't want kings, we don't want empires, we don't want everything that in this Romano-Germanic reality had been established, right? Because this moment actually is one of strong consolidation exactly of those traditional structures. Papacy and empire fundamentally come out strengthened after this period, achieving an extraordinary success. As you know, later on, Christianizing, for example, the second invaders, even leaving for the Crusades, and with an enormous force and an enormous level, properly, of even technical engineering culture that you cannot simply explain by, okay, well, this was just a backward world was hit by raiders, murderers, whatever, and then gradually it simply survived. There was a massively active and incredibly sound work effort expansion from the within that eventually overflowed, right, arguably to nowadays, because most, I presume, of what eventually the European order was established in this high medieval phase, and of course with a consolidation later on, is in great part, in fact, the Europe we see today, right? For many reasons, but also in the vernaculars, even in properly even in the territorial dimension, and even though we don't have to read it, of course, in a teleological sense, we cannot essentially ignore the fact that even certain national notions, at least in the Latin sense of the word, were affirmed dramatically at this point. I mean, pick Germany. At the time of the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, there wasn't such a thing like a German Nazi, right? No, there had never been. Historically, the various ethnic duchies didn't think of themselves like that. From the 10th, the 11th century, we start realizing that there's properly a Teutonic kingdom. It doesn't matter how, of course, diverse within itself it really was, but at the end of the day, stuck together and was to evolve in essentially a national direction. And interestingly enough, in that case, as the same name of the country was fabricated in the monastic centers of Fulda, of St. Gallen, and so on, by the elites, right? It was an elite process. We'll see this better because I've already made a lot of videos actually about lordships, encastellation, the vassalatic beneficiary system, fiefs. We have seen this throughout all this period. Recently, I just made videos about how European monarchies came about throughout this time. Of course, mostly focusing on post-Carolingian Europe, that I think is dramatically overlooked. Again, the Vikings in popular culture kind of steal the scene to everyone. But again, how much do we actually need? I already answered you a lot, really, as Westerners, to recover the awareness of what post-Carolingian Europe, continentally speaking, really was. Right, how important the history of the post-Carolingian countries was for defining essentially Europe as we know it, not just in a broader long-term fashion, but literally again for what would have happened in the following centuries as far as the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire were concerned, and beyond. There are, of course, other regional realities that you must take in consideration because they also start being part of this system, even though, of course, we start from the realization that it was stemming from the boundaries of the Carolingian Empire, but it expanded further as far as Christianization was concerned, but literally as far also as conquest was concerned. At some point, just think about England or Sicily or the Christianization of Poland or Hungary. The same Frankish influence in the Iberian Peninsula. that we've seen recently in the video about the origins of Aragon, Navarre, in Catalonia. We'll of course talk about Leon, Castile at some other point. But this frame is consolidated essentially after 1 century in which Europe didn't even properly have a stable territorial regime of royal scale, right? Even at a single country level, which is really revealing in terms of how powerful, or at least how much, if you don't want to stress that aspect, because of course they are gradual phenomena, but again, 1 century, again in the 10th century, we're still really primitive and poor realities, so there were lots of resources that start being available, and in relative terms, really what happens in this Western Europe is amazing. But it also speaks even to something that existed before, right? And in this regard, we are tricked also by the idea of the Dark Ages, of the early Middle Ages, as if also just what the Carolingians had done or had been relevant. The Merovingians suffer a lot of actually having accomplished or provided at least the Carolingians with the same things that the Carolingians would have been praised for. In all, practically, we don't appreciate enough the ecclesiastical, the evangelization of Europe as far as properly the cultural, the administrative, the political connections, and the spiritual force, right, with all these lands as far as England, as Ireland, with Rome, had been just, again, after, the migration era. And we tend always, again, not to see it, because, again, everybody is more interested in what is the hardcore kind of popularized ethnicistic, tribalistic, warrioristic, barbaristic topic that we can make cheap and dump documentaries on. And let's not talk about the massive Western accomplishment in anything political, institutional, cultural, and more, because we're talking actually about a hell of course, as you understand in Carolingian times, for example, military systems, of administrative systems, of also cultural accomplishment. I mean, the Carolingian and papal ecclesiastical reform was a massive accomplishment in terms of also, for example, of monastic spread, and thus the creation of a net was properly the connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe in the absence, de facto, of a lay overlordship. And these are all phenomena that, again, you hardly even, they're not popularized, right? You don't find actual documentaries about this stuff. You don't hear people talking about this. You don't see people even having ever heard of this stuff, right? It's as if a massive chunk of the hardcore Western identity, accomplishments, capacity had been simply removed from a lot of space, including, of course, the school one, because, of course, there are, in synthesis, apparently more punching moments where you, of course, can appreciate ups and downs and so on, but in order to explain even these ones, you have to be aware of what happened in between, and not kind of, because mostly we have this attitude of mockery towards the past, right? This is very popularized, if not surprisingly, in a Fourth Estate world, where, again, you don't have to make the masses aware of their insignificance, culturally, existentially, personally, and whatever. So everything that was an actual accomplishment in the past, also in a moment of crisis, is slapped on, is belittled. Is saying, this Middle Age I've met, actually, like, of course, for my audience, I'm sure that there may be, of course, someone who thinks that the Middle Ages were somehow a tough time where people didn't do but surviving, that people didn't read, or they didn't travel, whatever. But I don't think we are at the point where you don't understand the civilizational accomplishment that this entailed, and at least wondering about the instruments that were used to carry this out successfully. And of course, most of you know perfectly well that it's a completely incorrect way of seeing Europe otherwise. And this I am particularly sensitive to, because you know that most of my YouTube content revolves around the concept of civilization, right? Not of barbarism for what it actually is, because barbarism does exist. It's not an invention. It's not a. It's actually part of the Indo-European mythology as a whole. So it's not again, as Fort Estaters can see only today, a nationalistic or socialistic thing. It's a deeply cultural, and it's a matter of standards, right? It's simply a matter of value and meaning and purpose that apparently, of course, today we are in dramatic shortage of, and that simply studying the Middle Ages for what they actually were, as we can completely, of course, assess in this broader dynamics by an important degree of approximation, of course, is uncontrovertibly self-evident. And the picture here also takes different form, because I always complain on Schwerpunkt not to have made enough videos about the territorial realities involved in especially this post-Carolingian phase, right? Because again, even that is not normally appreciated or known or cared about. Is mostly this kind of intricate period of strange sub-kings fighting against each other for having still a not even properly a regional scale dominion, territorially speaking. But it's actually starting from the local communities that you understand how much was affirmed at this point properly the need of a hierarchy, of a standard value, of a strong support also to the authority, as it was essentially the only one left locally being able to do anything. And so involving the local community as well. This is of course a moment of crisis, don't get me wrong. It's exactly the crisis that pushes the system to recover from this. We have to understand, as we were saying before, how much the system lacked in statal, public, central base before this. Because literally, if you think about the Carolingian Empire, it's not even 300 years after the fall of the West. So we're not talking about particularly advanced areas. Or areas that had previously had much of a, particularly concentrated power outside of what had been the structure the Romans had fundamentally established, and that, in fact, most of the Romano-Germanic rulers had ruled from at the end of the day, and with important difficulties. It's what is created at the base of this that sediments an incredibly strong stratum that was connected still with the idea of a hierarchy, and it was hardly like an establishment system at all. They were to create the system from scratch because the previous one had, in that sense, failed to be firmly based, right, and to also be up to standards that objectively in different parts of Europe did exist, right? The Latin Germanic communities, for example, were of course aware of the Byzantine Empire, of the Cordovan Caliphate, and of course they were different. We have in fact stressed the somehow this is another prejudice, the backwardness of Latin Germanic Europe compared to these other worlds, like the Golden Age of Islam, and afterwards the translations from Greek and Arab. So it must have all come from the East. It didn't, right? Most of the Western growth, but of course, by decisive measure, was an internal development. That, of course, there were differences within the same system. As you understood following my videos, you realized that essentially, of course, Latin Europe was dramatically more advanced than, first of all, what is usually thought, also in comparison to the aforementioned polities, but of course compared to, say, what we call Germanic Europe, Slavic Europe. And there was an important continuity even there with the Roman legacy that you can beautifully find, in fact, in especially in countries that had been part of the western half of the empire, right? Even you can argue that even the Cordoban Caliphate was an accomplishment of essentially a strongly Romanized reality in many ways. And even there, we often say, well, but there's Spain was ruled by the Muslims practically, so it's another thing. Yeah, okay, but the people there were the same, right? So there is no such thing like a substitution. In fact, we have exaggerated even the impact and the scale of the second invasions per se, right? All in the 19th century, the myths about ethnogenesis, national characters, race, etc., because of social Darwinism, were exploited to claim things like, I don't know, why in the 19th century the Italians were backwards compared to the rest of Western Europe. It's because, I don't know, the Saracens had polluted the race during the Middle Ages because the Romans were so advanced. And but this is BS, right? There is no evidence of impacting, for example, Berber dimension in the northern shores of the Mediterranean during the Saracen era, for example. But for the obvious and self-evident fact that notoriously, by the way, throughout all history, the northern shores of the Mediterranean were dramatically more populated than the northern African ones, and that if you really want to see much of an impact, right, it was actually the one of Europeans in North Africa, without mentioning that there was a big deal, in fact, of Europeization of North Africa during even the Roman Empire, and some of those areas were also particularly advanced back in the day. So we live in a world that has been schizophrenic about this period, right? The Victorian era depicting the Vikings like obsessive, bloodthirsty serial killers and monsters and animals and whatever, and then today, the Vikings being, the greatest angels that the civilization of mankind has ever seen. The Magyars are a bit forgotten, right? I made videos about this. The importance, for example, of the Slavic Magyar frontier is of brutal importance for the entire European development. What the Ottonians achieved in Central Europe against the Hungars was one of the single most impacting accomplishment of Western civilizations, as the space of Central Europe in its vastity was not, even again with such lack of pre-existing public culture, something that today we keep for granted, but at the time wasn't, right? There could be a failed state in Germany as much as it happened, I don't know, in Burgundy, for example. As we've seen, there was even the Western Frankish kingdom, it would emerge to be the most powerful, was actually the worst in terms, at least, of political of centralization, and probably of monarchic unitary direction at a point. So even there, the Capetian monarchy was not meant necessarily to take off, right? You have exceptions like also the Italic kingdom that fails as a monarchy, but also has a dramatic civilizational output with the communal phenomenon and beyond, so at the base of humanism of the Renaissance. It's a complex thing, as you understand, but it's also an incredibly overlooked dynamic in interest of causes. What is the point here? Like, can we, picture a sort of contrast to understand better what the change was concretely about. Well, if you look at Europe towards the mid 11th century, right? So we're talking, of course, about mostly post-Carolingian Europe. In basically all the areas here considered, the sources witness a political reality, of course, accompanied by a social, economic profile, etc., that is very, very different from the Carolingian one, right? And when you look at the time of Charlemagne and the one even of his first successors, you see evidently that every field, right, of these cultures had importantly been modified. The change is accessible, first of all, as we were saying before, on a political institutional level, right? In Carolingian times, you had a tendentially unitary organization of power, right? You can't go as far as saying that was a Carolingian state, right? Especially the most enlightened Carolingian rulers, so Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, had perfectly realized, also given that the Franks had reached the peak of their expansion at that point, that in order to keep control on the wall, you had to concentrate power, to establish a territorial administration, to have some power that was not just the merely private one, that technically the same empire was, because the Franks, since Merovingian times, had established essentially a dynastic power, right? People had, as we'll see now, undergone an important, social stratification, but especially everything was considered in private terms. It wasn't such a thing like, there's a state, it belongs to, there's a public domain. This public domain is the king's as a person, because he, in his blood, and this, we have made lots of videos about the sacralization of the Merovingian dynasty, of course, is sacred, right, by a degree, and so this fits, again, the hierarchy of values that exist within the society, because also the lesser, say, lords believed that they were sacred compared to their clients, and then the commoners were essentially losing power dramatically, and then the slaves were technically not even human beings by a degree, and so the whole profile really fit that kind of vision, right? Of course, this couldn't go on if you wanted to, bring order, to uniform control, to have a direct territorial grip, if you wanted to maintain the frontiers intact, if you wanted to have an effective military system that wasn't just fueled by loot per se, and eventually by resettlement or part of the same under the local private rule that you had delegated as a king by name, but the fact of losing control of that's literally how the Carolingian Empire crumbled, because aside from this, of course, the Carolingians themselves had completely not given up their dynastic idea that the father's inheritance had to be split equally, right, among all the sons. So this would fragment the entire system, because again, the entire system was private. It belonged to a family. It wasn't something like the one that these kings called themselves kings of the Franks, of other peoples, but it was the elite that factually ruled and controlled the whole thing. So this elite doesn't seem like much of a good reason, once that they had overstretched their control in a unitary sense in this huge land, and began to parcel it and simply to entrench in their own possessions, and to realize that the continuation of this system, given that also the imperium was God-given, and so if the Carolingian emperor hadn't much of a possibility of expanding further, nor of obliging the subjects to simply obey his direct rule, right? They felt perfectly legitimated to simply let the thing go, right? Being on their own, and of course understanding the value of cooperation, the importance of force and overlordship, because that also was universal and traditional. And of course there are massive civilizational advantages from that, so they understood them perfectly. But they understood also that this could start simply by consolidating by a certain degree locally, and not really seeing much of a challenge coming from this. And that's where also the second invasions should be read through, right? The second invasions were essentially rendered possible by the support of the Post-Carolingians. You see it everywhere. The Vikings in Gaul, the Magyars in Germany, the Saracens in Italy, and actually all these three peoples, invaded all these three kingdoms. All of them, even the Saracens, crossed the Alps into the Rhineland from the south, just to make an example. Of course, were supported by the local nobility. Well, how do you think they came? We know that Carolingian counts supported the Vikings, sold weapons to them, participated in their raids in Gaul. We know that the Longobards princes of southern Italy simply hired the Saracens and sent them against one another, against the Byzantines, or to keep their own autonomy, and allowed them to be there. The Eastern Frankish nobles, princes, let the Magyars crossing their own territory, right? Because they were heading in richer lands where they wanted to plunder better, and as long not to have troubles, they simply let them pass. And the thing lasted until, of course, these peoples were somehow becoming too much of a undesired presence, and when they realized that they politically compacted and threw them out. And of course it was difficult because there was a general crisis, there was a general chaos or disorder, but this was caused fundamentally just by these single actors that had been the same identical ones that had made the Carolingian Empire otherwise in a unitary direction before, right? And what we see is that in spite of all this, during the 10th century, most of the resources, in fact, of the post-Carolingian rulers are devolved not to defend also from the second invasion, also from a military point of view. Yes, they were impacting, but they weren't the major threat posed to the locals, right? The phenomenon of encastration, for example, is mostly, at least as seen in pop culture, depicted. They have to build castles because there were invaders. Then you study this thing archaeologically, and you see another thing. You see that basically the castles built to stem these incursions that were frequent, but say in the single kingdoms, but not literally in the same places, right? They happen at several years distance. There were areas that weren't even particularly hit, and so on. You realize that most castles were built not in the places where eventually these invasions could be stopped, right? They even did so. They built castles on passes, etc. But most of them, the overwhelming majority of the resources of encapsulation were invested in the heartlands to essentially control the surrounding countryside, to its communities, its populations, its working force, and of course in order to counter other local lords neighboring those lands. And what you see in this, in fact, thick net of fortifications that covered the entire... Today you don't see that, right? Most castles you see in Europe are things dating from the late Middle Ages, even the early modern age in some countries. Because, first of all, constructions went on, and especially in more developed countries, at a certain point you took away castles because they were useless. And that, in this sense, actually places where you can see most castles very often were either massive feudal monarchies, like maybe Castile, that takes the name after castles and some, but even in that case, you don't see essentially the 10th century ones, also because they were mostly made in earth and timber, and or countries that essentially remained feudal in nature until the 19th century, such as Germany, for example. There's plenty of beautiful castles that mostly are literally where you can see stratified from the core of those years, but that just stayed there because the country wasn't unified until a point that the contemporary world could enter much more violently in there, right, in the same France. Just think about how many castles there were before, even like in England, before the beautiful ones you could see still today of the 12th and 13th century were the product of some of the most centralized monarchies, right? In fact, most of them you can find in France, England, Sicily, but for the rest, it's nothing in comparison to what existed before. In terms of numbers, and also if you consider in absolute terms, it's as if those same resources had been evenly distributed on the territory. Also because, of course, the more feudal monarchies compacted their territorial control, they needed to concentrate more troops, and the castles. They would be able to concentrate more troops, and castles accordingly were also more concentrated, right? There is not a cause effect precedence here. It's the same thing at the same time, but then you see there just a compaction of a Chateau Gaillard that is in a phase of the French-English conflict. It was very much compact, like it's almost two countries, but two regional powers directed one against the other. And this is very interesting to study from also a socio-economical point of view, right? Because you realize, for example, in countries like Italy, that castles were built not because of a specific military emergency, but because the people who made the castles could sell them to those who were interested in having them. There is also a level, in fact, of trade and monetization increasing dramatically throughout this time. You realize that encastration in some places was not possible until the second invasions even stopped. Right, the area around Rome witnessed an important level of encastration. For example, just after the Saracens were dislodged from their base in the at the mouth of the Garigliano River, you see that after all the way, in fact, the Westerners managed to sweep their territory out of intruders was quite quick once that they accomplished their own internal, balance and regulation. Think about the base of Fraxinetum in Provence and how it was taken out. It was essentially a political game between the Ottonians and the Cordobans that had kept it existing. It wasn't like a particularly difficult thing to take out if there had been a political will to do so. That's a very important key to read the event. To make the long story short, because we could digress endlessly here, because there are lots of beautiful examples. You realize that, of course, as we were saying before, the only possible base in the absence of a public one to concentrate power is still the private one. And this is fantastic because you realize, of course, the civilizational need to concentrate power in spite of the pre-existing customs. There is a strong effort against this pre-existing kind of more individualistic mentality that simply said, as long as I'm okay, fuck everybody else, right? And this was literally how most people sold that. And of course, this emerges from a lack of civilization, because a system that works like that doesn't have a hierarchy, doesn't have power, doesn't have civilizational accomplishment. So people sometimes here criticize them because they said individualism is a value. But actually, in the hardcore traditional doctrine, individualism is not a value, because what's the individual, right? Of course, the individual is the actor that eventually can accomplish something, but it's exactly that level of of stupidity in, say, not realizing the advantages that come from even just establishing a hierarchical rule over other people that prevents people from doing anything. It's today's mental anarcho-populistic mental disease that brings people to say, it's just me. And you don't understand that you fail if you're just you, because all great civilizations work because there was a political cohesion that made things succeed, right? And that's hardly an individual thing, right? This is the moment in which the hyper dramatically collectively trained cavalry, right, heavy smashing shock charging cavalry is formed, and that doesn't work with a single guy. You have to perform that collectively. And together with that, nobility was affirmed as properly a military class that ruled exactly from these patrimonial dominions that had been affirmed, right? So the individual is just but the start, right? Eventually there is a God-given power that can shine on you as a medium, but has to do with how much force you're able to gather from the world entire, and so from the people as well. And without that, you can hardly have any other capacity, because at the end of the day, the objective is to transfigure humanity in order to achieve this power. And this is true for all the forces that make up humanity as well. And the Milites of this age were perfectly aware of this, because they still remembered. We don't know exactly how they would phrase this in their own deep, kind of hard core intimate belief and models and pictures. This was of course a world that was undergoing a modernization and secularization in the process too, but the importance of the Cingulum Militaris, and of course what eventually consolidates in the 12th century in this properly said knighthood, right? And all that, what the dubbing ceremony really meant. You realize that it was soaked into the millennia-old militaristic tradition that had actually been reinvigorated at this point, also through the second invasions concept with other peoples, but this professionalization of the military that before had also in part brought to the loss of some of those values as well, because as we will see now, it was fundamentally the freemen that accepted to confer power to others in exchange for just like a more modest living. Right? This is also, of course, a civilizational process, but it's a double-edged sword, because the freemen lost such freedom, and that's yet another aspect that is properly not publicized, because to us the idea is, the migration era happens, the barbarians were more egalitarian, established this control. This is already not true, because during the migration era, the confederacies had dramatically stratified the society per se. Properly, the concept of leadership was enhanced in moment of emergency, and it stayed like that. So in the early Middle Ages, you can't. But even before, right, even in tribal times, you couldn't quite talk about freedom, right, where everybody was freely equal. That depended on the fact that we're essentially very poor, and so there weren't so many social differences, and you could kind of fabricate that kind of ideology. And of course, tribesmen were very wary up to a certain point towards the nobility, and they still were, but to a degree that had dramatically sunken over time. So the importance of the hierarchy and the necessity of the same, especially, is the hallmark of civilizational power, and we're talking about a massive military one, as opposed to mere just out there and on their own. Because as we have seen in the vassalitic beneficiary system as well, if you had to have a kind of agricultural expansion just in the hands of the peasantry, you would have got nothing. You would have gotten kind of an anarchic thing that wouldn't work, etc. The peasants would try eventually to do so in the 14th century, and they failed miserably, even though they literally controlled the entire agricultural production. And this because, of course, the elite was much more intelligent, rational, capable, and would manage to increase, in fact, even the broader profits in this dramatically expanding system, because they had seen properly how to make the thing work on a bigger scale, right? So again, don't think even here, of course, the elite is just like the hyper elite or whatever, because civilizations that stretch that too far also become weak, right? It's always a double threat. There must always be a balance. But at the same time, in order to need power, you also need a hierarchy. And without that, you can't go anywhere. So always respect what, again, power is in the world, because that is always God-given, right? And when somebody fails, realize why they fail, not because there is a terrible hierarchy that is preventing that, but because they are objectively the weak ones, and thinking otherwise is just to be of the paranoid sub-person type that was present in a crystalline clear way in all the mythology of these peoples, without any exception. So we'll talk about this also as far as the militia, the militia actually proper, because here we're talking about not the militia as we intend today, but literally the milites as a class, and how it was formed through the masnata and through also the peasant force that actually was all but, at this point especially, kind of merely passive, right? The peasantry was much more, let's say, controlled in the modern age than in the Middle Ages, as a matter of fact. And the peasants were very often, as of course the lower strata of the population are the most disgustingly savage and aggressive and stupidly violent that you can find, and they were, they were scared, right? This force is growing in Europe that was importantly populated after all, and they had their own power, and they were still kind of provided with that kind of warrior mentality that made them aware, of course, of the importance of their own liberty. Were feared by the nobility as well at this point, and they participated sometimes also on an even plane. As entire communities, of course, the social divide was still pretty strict, but they were political entities. They weren't just, classes or however they told you to think medieval history like, right? Because it's a much more active and dynamic and go out there, right, thing compared to the incredible amount of alienated people that literally we are becoming. As if, sometimes people contact me and say, I want to know how a single person lived out there in the early Middle Ages, the techniques, the materials. They didn't, right? They were always political and military communities projected towards the outer side. There isn't the lie you've been fed with that there is a magic formula or trick to make things work without effort, just accumulating tiny stuff every day like you can do on an RPG game, right? So it's a much more brutal and forcefully overt, outwards projected, let's say, reality where if you don't move and if you don't associate in a strongly politically and violent way, you cannot go anywhere. And that's where exactly the Milites come from, because these are literally the people who evolved from, something that, of course, already existed, arguably, right? To some degree, at least knighthood was there. We've seen it many times in the retinues, in the comitatus, in the fiannas, and so on. Look at even the most primitively, brutally underdeveloped areas of Europe. They have properly knights as a common. Look at the Vandal era. The hero is a guy on horseback, right? And we don't think of those cultures as particularly, equestrianly versed in a collective sense at least. Instead, they were an individual base, because that was the only possible way of managing to dominate the world from the above, because that with a continuous thread, you're right to the Babenberger Ritter and the 12th century humanism and the the Laude Nove Militia of Bernard de Clairvaux. And so it was always the same system, right? That was, however, just taking different forms given the political, military, and social balance. However, I've done of this. If you're interested, especially I have a playlist on the history of knighthood, which often touches on the 10th century per se, because it was the seminal moment as far as properly as the military class was concerned, that which eventually chivalry, or what we call as such, emerged. But it already existed since prehistory, right? So, another important difference from Carolingian times in this one is that once Carolingians did have a degree of public authority. Again, they had tried establishing that. Think about the lay and the ecclesiastical missi, for example, that were ruling, however, not very differently from how the lay and the ecclesiastical ruler would from the average European district since any other Romano-Germanic time. The important was to centralize the process, so to have some powerful figure that could interfere with the local communities, and so also with the elites, to check them from, and so also sparking a degree of competition that could hopefully remain within the institutional structure. But as we've seen, private forces were so strong in the Carolingian world that, and the public ones were so new, that there was no match, right? So in Carolingian times, there actually were, in the vast of public officials, of course, private figures seen as royal and imperial officials, right? At the end of this period, instead, say the mid-11th century, what you realize is that public authority de facto has become a personal, private property, also from an institutional point of view, of the single families, right? This is evident, for example, in the Allodium, but not only. There is probably a local custom that has been often sanctioned by the same king or emperor, because he couldn't control the place while the power was reforming. And so they just gradually accepted that, yes, these families had some rights that could not be alienated. The Allodia could not be alienated, even though in theory everything that was on the kingdom's soil was the king's property, which is quite interesting. And of course, it does conceive the fact that there was some private property that was such untouchable, right? So it speaks of a degree of imperium that these local owners had fundamentally achieved, right? We're not even necessarily talking about the nobility here, right? Here we're talking even of very powerful landowners, merchants. It really depends, and naturally it's dramatically varied all over Europe. There are cities, there are areas like the ones of the forest. They are hardly the same people. They're hardly the same institutions, the same past. There are, now I won't be explained, but you know what I mean, right? The Carolingian heartland was mostly a place where there were cities, but there were also royal residences, but most of the possessions were in the countryside, huge mansions, which also the Merovingians stereotypically were recluded back in the day, far from, in fact, but were increasingly becoming the centers of power. In Southern Europe, mostly you had, in fact, the cities as the center of power, with a literary elite, with even probably a municipal pride, some autonomous military associations. So everything is really to look at in detail. We still have to do it really on Schwerpunkt. What is, however, obvious is that in a pre-industrial society, the overwhelming majority of the people lived in the countryside. And looking at this rural population is key to understand how the situation really was. Well, by the mid-11th century, yes, the rural population is technically not free anymore, because it's being subdued by the lay and the ecclesiastical lords. Why also? Because they administer justice. They demand and organize, the military and economical performances. They collect taxes that they use to build infrastructure, bridges, mills, etc. They exercise other heavy forms of conditioning of the rustics that, however, have technically provided their lords with that power. Right. This also will be institutionalized. That gradually, even just the inheritance by law of the various fiefs, from the largest to the smallest, is sanctioned, and so this means that the public authority had lost control of the same, because that previously again belonged to the king in theory. Instead, this thing becomes even hereditary. But the regime that establishes itself, especially of what we call the nobility, on the rustics, on the peasantry, is due to the fact that obviously the peasants were contributing kind of in a more rationalized way, say, to the development, for example, of a professional military that could more effectively govern the territory, and secure it from invasions. This was again a perennial struggle against neighboring political bodies. Again, what materialistic historiography has erased from the picture here is that, by simplifying the didactical explanation of these systems, they told you that, you have to reason through the concept, of course, of classes, of socioeconomics, and so everything is just a huge blob that you segment horizontally. But all of the system was segmented vertically, and the local nobility and peasantry thought that, the neighbors had to be subjugated in the same way. So they necessarily had to cooperate, right? And what you see, of course, in the development of a professional military is something more qualitative than quantitative. But next to, again, the seniors masnata, you find the peasantry that, again, is pretty dramatically, aggressively bloodthirsty and carries out some of the most ruthless bloodshed that you can ever imagine against other peasants, against other, even the noblemen. But still, of course, this reflects the fact that the peasants had provided somebody else, had entrusted power to somebody else. There is a debate regarding this, because it happens to me also when I go to conferences to explain moments of crisis and so on. People say, but, how we can assess. Well, it's both things at the same time. It was oppression, but how far can you say that oppression is unavoidable? Right? The moment in which you think that the order is going to crush you, you have already lost. You have already given up. You said, okay, I can't do anything else. The Milites had emerged instead because they were more powerful, of course, in certain cases, as families from before. But also, and this is for whoever has studied the origin of the militia, of course, they were just random people, right? The knighthood locks to the nobility in the third, fourth of the 12th century. Throughout all these centuries, if you were just an average peasant who had, say, killed a knight in an ambush and just took his horse and armor and arms and wanted to fight like him and succeeded, could become in fact a miles in the retinue of a lord who made videos about ministeriales, for example, to gradually, being entrusted. And sometimes even the fact of being a serf was actually a mean of promotion, paradoxically. Many serfs became castellans because they were most faithful to the lords, as they wouldn't have protection outside of their own out there in the world, and they would be entrusted with the control of a castle as administrators, and then maybe the lord died, and or over time they were conferred some prerogatives that were somehow becoming free, because there is not a register that says you're free or you're not free, we have to check out. Like, that simply depends on how powerful you actually are. Sometimes, of course, it was the case. The Ministeriales in Germany, for example, are the best example of that. We made many videos about that. The majority of German knights is fundamentally a serf, right? It belongs to other lords, and part of the reason there is that Germany had less of a public authority, and so the local clergymen, the same, even lay power, even the emperors, of course, had invested more in all these outcasts that didn't have really a place and could be brought under their regime, but they would always remain, in fact, non-freemen, because you could simply sell them and you could more easily dislocate them, and even bringing them to fight than in other places. And of course, in countries like that, the difference in socially speaking was more ferocious, because literally outside of the elite, nobody was a free person. Right? This is a radical important thing to understand, and that lasted for centuries and centuries. In the Germany of Conrad II, we even made a video about him, the majority of people were somebody else's. These had technically been freemen at a point. They weren't somebody else's because they were just descending from slaves. It's literally that the freemen as such had gradually lost their freedom, and there had not been political institutional authority that could preserve it, and it was normal simply to own people, to tell them again, you can live here, you can't, you have to be sent here, you have to perform this military service, or you have to give me a certain part of your agricultural output. And it was much more heavier in a cultural sense than, say, a place like the Italian communes, where people were literally free by definition as communes, and they were freemen in arms. And still, the concept is that if you had the right to bear arms, because you were free, and technically, just like anybody who wore the cingulum militaris, that even though this was a prerogative, as you understand, that was being defined ever more just for the Milites that were even in those cities, those who were actually in charge, but you still were kind of a noble, because what other person can bear arms in this situation? There had been a massive amount of disarmament of the peasantry, right? This is particularly evident even from Carolingian times, where, after all, this process had not yet undergone the full consequences of post-Carolingian times. Of course, it was a crisis. Of course, it was a civilizational collapse at the time of the fall of the empire, per se. It was not a positive thing at all. But exactly for this, it had to restart from a functional base, for the same reason that this was the necessity after the collapse, that even of a system that even it had not been able to hold. And you find such system to of course affirm the prerogatives of those who were already more powerful over the other people, right? And illegally so in many ways. But then, starting from this kind of lordship, seigniorial system, manorial system, whatever you want to call it, depending on the various continental national historiographies, but it's always part of the same picture, right? And properly, this society is the major society is dramatically evident, right? The greatest change from Carolingian times is this neat distinction that divides the freemen, right? They do not form anymore, like in Carolingian times, at least theoretically homogeneous system. And actually, this, since the times of the Roman Empire, even the late Roman Empire, had been quite problematic, to say the least, because, again, the social differences were huge, and also in early imperial times, you don't really find much of free people, especially in the more developed areas, right? And again, doesn't mean necessarily they lived worse than places where people were theoretically more free, but because there was not enough surplus locally to maintain an elite that could, control them, right? So, for example, the Ständiger revolt in Germany, in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, in Carolingian times, is quite relevant, because even the slaves and the freemen allied themselves against the elite, because they realized they were being essentially taken out after the Carolingian conquest, and that was stratifying in a way that in Germany had never been seen before. But they lost, of course, because they were still kind of at the periphery of a broader system where the hierarchy was dramatically advanced and powerful. And Germany is very telling because it had partially been already, as you know, colonized, not just from Roman times, but throughout the Merovingian ones. So there were areas that had literally remained at various shades, right? Areas that had probably never been neither under the Romans nor under the Franks. Some under the Franks, but not under the Romans. Some under the Romans and the Franks. And you can see the differences there as a layer. And you wouldn't be surprised, I hope at least, to realize that most of those differences still exist in Germany today. That the more developed areas are in the west and in the south, and the north and the east ones, at least, just historically weren't. And this stuff, when I say it started back then, it is real, right? And there was a massive continuity also with dynamics that we can see from previous times as well. Just it wasn't made exactly in this point only, right? There was a theoretical homogeneous system before. It said that if you were free, how, right? Just because you could leave without someone asking you to, asking you corvée, right? That is the measure of freedom or liberty. Well, everybody was kind of always bound to somebody else. It was never an anarchic order where people just lived out there in the wild without. In some, again, there was the world of the forest. Many areas of the western and the eastern Frankish kingdom were really just cut out of the rest, right, of the cities, of the great centers of power. But they were also the ones that, in fact, were not to govern over everyone. Out there in an Atlantic plain of Gaul, of course, you had always been under somebody else. In a sense, but nobody had ever pressed you to do more than much. So over time, at least this is debatable, more than much, how much? It's half plenty or half empty glass, right? It's always a matter of, even before the Romans in Gaul, fundamentally the Celtic elite dominated over people that were in theory freemen, that de facto were serfs, right? So the more advanced areas had always been in that kind, but there was also a more expansive capacity that could provide the freemen with the idea, for example, of promotion. There were freemen that, again, didn't have any particular nobiliary past, but had made money with trade and were becoming important landowners. So these things did happen, but the majority had juridically and politically sunk. Compare also to a hierarchy that was, for the first time, kind of evolving, right, in a local sense, in a more kind of vertical way than before, because the vassalic beneficiary system concentrates an enormous amount of wealth in the hands of few that, however, constantly reinvested. So it's not just an exploitation. To what end? Right, these peoples are literally creating, again, kingdoms from counties, from local, sometimes even just from single castles, as we've seen in many, like we were talking about Styria recently. That's how an entire region took the name after from a castle of Styria, and it began like that, a dynasty that gradually from the top began to accumulate wealth and power. But because there were people also who were supporting it locally, because that was one of the best way to pacify, to consolidate, to stabilize the region. There can't be one thing without the other, right? And there is always a balance that you have to appreciate, but the point is that if you fail, because you exceed either in one way or the other, there is somebody who is taking advantage of you from the outside, that is kind of still bringing to the next level its own community, and even kind of incorporating you in its own, so to even provide with an opportunity for those who are capable enough to be part of the system. So that's how eventually the Western world advanced, like elites that give a redemptional chance to those who deserve it for their capacity. And that's again also how the military retinues came about. An important distinction de facto passes between those who again are able to arm themselves. So of course the as you've seen before, capacity of fighting, of defending yourself, is eventually one that, prolonged over time, defines also the capacity of your community to not to be subjected by force. And this takes a social form, as we've seen in the militia, that acquires an enormous prestige and prerogative, and so the milites, we can say by approximation, start to rule over all the other people. The peasants would have had their own militias, but they were subjected to the milites to start becoming decisive also on the battlefield, but also they never fight without the support of the peasants. Cavalry will become decisive de facto just only in Western Europe by the mid-12th century, it is fair to say. Before that, infantry still can say something on its own. It is properly defending a place on its own, of course entrenched. Throughout all the early Middle Ages, cavalry had already been stronger than infantry, differently from ancient times. But the balance was much greater, right up to the lock of the same militia in the aforementioned third quarter of the 12th century. And their cavalry will remain unchallenged as the decisive arm in open field and in council, let's say, just for another century, a bit more than another century. So the full dominance of cavalry per se, and so also of its elements, is not just absolute at all. It requires, again, the support of the population that basically, if you wonder, again, of how all those powers were concentrated in the hands of few, is that they were constantly spent, mostly for war. And so the entire society starts revolving around the miles, right, to train him, not to provide the fodder for the horse, the maintaining him to train a lifetime, producing his arms and armor, but also indoctrinating him religiously. To become a crusader, you need to invest also in a lot of priesthood, right, next to them. So you can argue that the entire political social system, that in fact will take the form of a private feudal monarchy, evolving in the following centuries as states, derives from this, revolves around the knight, right? Economically speaking, what you have, as we were saying before, is a rationalization in the management of the agricultural output, right? A peasant labor is much better organized, regimented, controlled, and channeled in traffics, in markets that are on an ever larger scale. And this is the merit, of course, of the same elite that favors indirectly also the development of the cities, of the great markets, in fact. And that's how also towards the end of this period you have a lot of those knights actually going to live in the city as well, because that's where they can control power better. They have castles like in the countryside in the form of house towers and so on. So it's basically the same thing. All this is a very gradual process. There are already cities, there are already other administrative forms, there is already literacy, but this intensifies dramatically in some places of Europe, differently from others, some remain really behind for a long time, right? The more north and the more east you go, but overall, this broader Frankish model, as it had been formed essentially from this Romano-Germanic aristocratic elite, spreads all over the world, right? As we're saying, up to today, in a sense, even though forms change, etc., we're still a consequence of this, because gradually this consolidates most of power in Western Central Europe, in the Mediterranean. It creates the Crusader states. It basically westernizes also the East in an important part. There are other dynamics. The trade shift carried out by the Italian maritime republics in the Mediterranean. The golden age of Islam thus ends, literally, as Europe begins to accumulate more precious metal. There is an evident Western technological advancement that basically reaches, if not surpasses, the Byzantines and the Arabs by the 12th century. There is a system, again, of knights, ships, artillery in the form of machine, of course, not gunpowder one. In military engineering, as far as properly castles, that by the 12th century start being built in stone, right? On a regular basis, there had been differences before already. On an infrastructural base, the South was much more, provided already with city walls, even properly sources of already building material, etc. But this homogenizes in that medieval civilization that we know in high medieval times, and that we know as the big, properly full medieval one that will contract just in the late 13th, first half of the 14th century, right? From a settlement point of view, like in the form of how also people lived concentrated, like you realize that the European countryside presents a again this incredibly fortified profile, right? It's literally changing in a way that not even in Carolingian times it existed. And Castellation had arguably always been there. All the places have always been somehow fortified, right? Not just even from... We tend to skip this, thinking like, how many centers existed since when, in, say, ancient times, that had their own fortifications and so on. But literally from Carolingian times, we realized that landscape changed in the process, right? And there were so many new villages and other changes because of even just demographic increase per se. And again, the population was settled in ever more mediated ways, guided by the nobility that we've seen also in some cases provided with rights to people who settle in certain communities to make them develop, to attract masses of immigrants that were much more common at the time because of the imbalances of the bigger system. The bigger system causes, greater growth and stabilization, but also, in absolute terms, it brings more people to move as they could remain cut out from some big movements as well. So there was a fierce competition between the various lords to settle more people, because more people on the countryside, on your land, meant more agricultural production. So the lords were the first ones to care about these resources. They were constantly investing in them, and so again, it was not an oppressive system as far as exploitation per se was aimed at, because the exploitation was aimed at expanding the system anyway, not to exhaust it. So it's a new world, right? We don't have to consider it, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, as just for example, the perishment of a allegedly better Carolingian reality, or such a confused period in which to look at the problems of the ensuing European developments. If we see the communes, the principalities, or the national monarchy, these are important. They start from there. But if you look at the timeline, you realize that this age is provided with its own specificity and also with a great dynamism. Right? It was just how the world was, right? It wasn't a point of arrival yet. People lived in it and worked like that and fought like that and ruled like that because it was the norm, right? So defining the, let's say, the dynamics correctly, the mechanics of this all, is crucial to appreciate properly the substance and the forms of the system. So as we were saying before, there are different ways to call this period. Some call it the Seigniorial age, right? Others prefer a bit more risky term of feudal age, which is complicated to assess. Even there, it's just a name, right? If you understand what the feud is, and how it was normal, it's a term that comes from the Celto-Germanic world. It was always about, seemingly originating about cattle exchange and handling subcontracting, and also the settlement, of course. And it had always been at the base of, in fact, what we better call vassalatic beneficiary system, because there was always a bassus in the form of a client and a senior in the form of a master that provided with this feud, originally amount of herd, right? Eventually properly lands, the mansi in Carolingian times is the standard, not much unit of measurement, but properly what the idea of a land plot to make people working on was provided as a beneficium, right? And so subcontracted, and the contractual dimension of this, as we were saying before, is crucial because, again, the communities actively participated to these contracts. When I talk that the elite were so central in this, it's, again, as we were saying before, they were elites that were on the top of something that made them being elite, right? Not the other way around, or at least it was compacting it in that direction by an evident, possibility, understanding that things could work better that direction. People call this period, of course, also the system, also the manorial one. There are different terms as far as especially the courtes, for example. The English call it the manorial system. The French tend to still apply seigniorial even to this idea. The Italians say that the courtly system after the courtes. Of course, in different parts of Europe, castles, rulers, etc., were called in slightly different ways, but most of this is also what the later historiography decided to apply in a broader sense, and not because at the time they were necessarily within that mindset, right, or use that terminology. Of course, they used it, but just in a more fluid way, depending on the realities. Naturally, the superimposition of all these divisions, both vertically and horizontally, brought to a gluing process that we can observe, in fact, in this period of a European fabric. Right, this had already been there. The Carolingians had done much about this. Monasticism had done much about this. The Roman Church done a lot about this. The same boundaries of Latin Germanic Europe and the Christian world, and probably the Western Christian one, had been neatly defined, after all, from the Muslims, the Byzantines. So what you see here is a much more unitarily compact system that you are often, let's say, you're often told, even just because we tend to, in fact, misrepresent this time mostly on the base of, again, 19th century maps with just boundaries and colors and homogeneity. It wasn't like that. But here we're talking about something that goes beyond, that is spiritual, that is moral, that, again, history in the last couple hundred years has not wanted to see things in the way of. And that instead has much to do with the traditional universal idea of power. It has to do with the unity of the empire and the unity of the church and the unity of the world and of divine rule that is shared, right, by Europeans that at this point successfully have a common script. They talk to each other. They have a common ecclesiastical administration. They have in fact, still a universal empire. They have international relations. They are basically all the same as far as the military side of the story is concerned. That is also not to be overlooked, right? At this point, the military class, the Milites, make up what we call, in an indistinguished way, Western European warfare. Right, in the very fringes there are some changes, like you can talk about the Celtic fringe, you can talk about, I don't know, the Reconquista. There are some slight differences everywhere, as we've seen. The various nationalities here are different as far as even where, I don't know, the knights live, but in terms of what they do, it's pretty much the same thing. They go to war together, they go to the crusades together. And they expand in various directions, right? Not just in fixed ones. It's probably a system that is overflowing. The Crusades in the Near East are just one aspect. There is the Reconquista, of course, but there is also the Baltic. There is the push towards the East, so-called. There is the gradual compaction of political realities also in Northern Europe, right? So there are lots of interesting dynamics that we still have to look at in detail. Again, 1600 videos, but hardly, yet an in-depth analysis of all these. But we must, because without them, you can't quite understand Europe in the way it is still today. And again, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, how many people care about this in pop culture? How many people care about this raw thing discussed today? How many documentaries will be made before anybody actually focuses on this? People don't seem aware of what such loss means, right? They don't understand what's the damage to a culture and to a civilization to be oblivious about these specific topics, right? It's a huge loss, and naturally we will have to explain how this process also worked better. Right, today I just presented you what some of the oldest followers, in terms of when they subscribed, of course, they can't remember, but that already, because I made multiple videos about this, but that may not be entirely clear. We'll never talk enough about telling the truth, because it's also a field in evolution historically. It was very much studied mostly from a socio-economical point of view back in the day, because it was mostly the French historiography, Les Annales, etc., that were mostly, again, the Marxistically influenced, and they arrived first to stress just the dichotomies between the land. Today we look mostly at it also from a political point of view, but it's obviously a blend of all the factors, right? It never ends in just one aspect, and especially they always this whole thing worked in ways that you want to appreciate from place to place, but also in its wall, right? You can't properly understand how it all works until it is put together, and you can't say, okay, well, I understand what this thing politically means, because I know what it economically means, for example. And the question that I set this video up for, of course, is how did we pass from the Carolingian system to what we've seen 200 years later? Well, you can explain it in different ways. Methodologically, you can stress the brusque break of the continuity or the gradual and slow evolution or transformation. And the vassalitic beneficiary system, I think, is particularly enlightening, because again, you can explain these things either by the lie that you've been perpetrated, it was just material reasons, or it's climate warming, or just the military class, it's all about clashes and battles and warriors and all this stuff. But what about at the political institutional level that sums up the whole thing? That is how they actually ruled it, and also throughout. They were the same people, by the way, that also fought, etc. So, but use your brain, right? Don't think that it's just posing yourself in a muscular fashion that makes you the thing done. Again, it's just how the freemen had lost their power, and it would keep losing them later on. Right, it's a strong mind that makes it, right? And there are characteristics of this era per se that must be highlighted. There are some, of course, some line here that evolves that you can track. And be aware that if you ever get in the historiographical debate of this, there are people thinking very different things about the same topics still, and that the only way to know this well is literally to read most of the sources we have at the time, and most of the historiography that is being written at the time is really enormous, so it's definitely not easy at all, and that's part of the reason also why it's it's probably not so appreciated, right? But it must be recovered just like an age per se. Just imagine you have been told there's been a Viking era. Imagine there is a vassalitic seigniorial era, let's call it in this way, and that it's equally cool, if not even more actually, and there is much more to know, and it's much more impacting to everything that you consider as a Western identity. And of course you've been deprived of that, because people count on your stupidity and on your ignorance to fool you and to exploit you. And if they succeed, it's good, of course, because you let them do it, but overall it's not in absolute terms something that favors the system, right? And learning about this period is understanding actually how they were much more intelligent than us, because you're surely not more intelligent nor more capable than a person living 1,000 years ago, to do the exact opposite and to develop Europe in a dramatically punching civilization, to the one that uninterruptedly has kept growing till today, and that you should maybe consider a bit more, instead of taking tangents and pretending that whatever emotionally impacted you for some subcultural or postmodern reasons has any relevance that we should actually also pay the consequences of. But it depends on all of us. So, as I just said, it always starts from ourselves and how much we really want to do anything positive as a change. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.